"You'll never teach my grandchildren music," my mother-in-law sneered, running her finger across the dusty piano in our living room. "Do you even know how to play?" The contempt in her voice was unmistakable. I kept my expression neutral as I gently lifted the piano cover, revealing the pristine ivory keys beneath. For 3 years, I had endured Margaret's constant criticism, but today felt different. Something in me shifted as I watched her scrutinize the instrument my grandfather had gifted me. "Actually," I said softly, "I do play a little." Margaret scoffed, adjusting her designer scarf. "A little isn't enough to teach proper technique. My Emily learned from the finest instructors in Vienna." Emily, my sister-in-law, was Margaret's crowning achievement, the perfect daughter who could do no wrong. I sat down at the piano bench, my fingers hovering over the keys. The familiar sensation brought back a flood of memories, late nights practicing until my fingers ached, the smell of rosin and wood polish, the thunderous applause at concert halls. "Thomas needs his children to be properly cultured," Margaret continued, referring to my husband. "Not just playing simple tunes for fun." I smiled, remembering how I had met Thomas at a charity concert where I was performing. He had been mesmerized, not knowing then that his mother would be less than impressed with his choice of wife. After our marriage, I had chosen to keep my musical background private, tired of being compared to Emily and her supposedly superior European education. "Would you like to hear something?" I asked, my fingers finding their position on the keys. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "I suppose, though I doubt." The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 filled the room, cutting off her words. The piece that had won me the National Young Artist Competition 13 years ago flowed through my fingers as naturally as breathing. I closed my eyes, letting the complex harmonies and challenging runs take over. I could feel Margaret's presence behind me, her criticism temporarily silenced by the cascade of notes. The piece built to its famous climax, my hands flying across the keys with practiced precision. As I played the final chord, the room fell into stunned silence. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered. "That's one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire." I turned to face her, maintaining my composure. "Yes, it is. Would you like to hear something else? Perhaps the piece I performed at Carnegie Hall when I was 16. Margaret's face had lost its usual superior expression. "You never mentioned." "Thomas never said." "That's because I asked him not to," I replied, standing up from the piano. After hearing so much about Emily's musical education, I decided to let my playing speak for itself when the time was right. Just then, Thomas walked in, carrying a box from our storage room. "Mom, I found those old photo albums you were asking about. And there's something else you should see." He set down a large crystal trophy, its surface catching the afternoon light. Engraved on its base were the words, "National Young Artist Competition. First place, Isabella Mitchell." Margaret's eyes widened as she read the inscription. "Mitchell? But that's—" "My maiden name," I confirmed. "There are more trophies in storage along with the reviews from my international tours." I stopped performing professionally when I decided to focus on teaching gifted young musicians. "Teaching?" Margaret's voice had lost its edge. "But you told us you were just giving piano lessons at the community center." "The community center is where I volunteer," I explained. "My actual studio is downtown, where I work with students preparing for conservatory auditions. 3 of my students were accepted to Juilliard last year." Thomas wrapped an arm around my waist, pride evident in his voice. "That's actually why I was looking for these trophies. The National Music Education Association is doing a feature on Bella's teaching methods. They wanted photographs of her competition days." Margaret sank into the nearest chair, her worldview visibly shaken. The carefully constructed narrative she had built about her son's unaccomplished wife was crumbling. "All this time," she murmured. "All this time," I agreed. "I've been listening to you praise Emily's musical education while belittling my abilities to teach my future children. I wondered when would be the right moment to show you that music isn't just about where you studied or who taught you. It's about passion, dedication, and the ability to connect with the piece you're playing." Thomas squeezed my hand, and I knew he understood why I had chosen today to reveal my past. With our first child on the way, it was time to clear the air about who would be teaching them music. "There's something else you should know," Thomas added, his hand resting protectively over my still flat stomach. "We're expecting." Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes darting between us. For once, she seemed at a loss for words. And yes, I said gently, I will be teaching our child music, just as my grandfather, a concert pianist, taught me. The room fell silent again. But this time it was different. The power dynamic had shifted, and we all knew it. Margaret stood up slowly, her usual confident posture slightly diminished. I think I need some tea, she said quietly, heading toward the kitchen. As she passed the piano, she paused, her hand resting on its polished surface. Perhaps you could play something else. After the tea, it wasn't quite an apology, but coming from Margaret, it was a start. The next morning, I arrived at my downtown studio early, expecting a typical day of lessons. What I didn't expect was to find Emily, my sister-in-law, waiting outside the elegant Victorian building that housed my music school. Mother told me everything, Emily said, her perfectly manicured hands clutching her designer handbag. Why didn't you ever say anything? All those times I talked about my performances. I unlocked the studio door, gesturing for her to follow me inside. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the row of gleaming grand pianos. Photos of my students lined the walls, alongside framed newspaper clippings of their accomplishments. Would you believe me if I said I enjoyed just listening? I replied, setting my sheet music on the nearest piano. You were always so passionate about your experiences in Vienna. Emily's eyes wandered over the wall of achievements. But you played at Carnegie Hall, she said softly. You toured internationally. Mother showed me the articles she found online last night. I smiled, remembering Margaret's face as she discovered more about my past. Your mother spent 3 years convinced I wasn't good enough for this family. Sometimes it's better to show than tell. A group photo caught Emily's attention, me standing with 3 beaming teenagers, all holding Juilliard acceptance letters. These are your students. Some of them. I nodded. Teaching brings me more joy than performing ever did. There's something magical about watching a young musician discover their voice. Emily's perfectly composed facade cracked slightly. I always wanted to teach, she admitted. But Mother insisted that performing was the only acceptable path for a serious musician. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Margaret had pushed Emily toward a performing career she didn't want, she had criticized my choice to teach, never knowing I had already lived the performance life she so admired. You know, I said, an idea forming, I'm actually looking for another instructor. The studio's growing, and I could use someone with your classical training background. Emily's eyes widened. But I haven't performed in years. Not since. Since you stopped enjoying it? I finished gently. Emily, you have years of excellent training and a genuine love for music. That's worth more than any number of forced performances. Before she could respond, the studio door opened and a young girl rushed in, her sheet music clutched to her chest. She stopped short at the sight of Emily. Miss Isabella, the girl exclaimed. I perfected the piece for the youth competition. I smiled at my students' enthusiasm. Perfect timing, Sophie. Would you play it for us? My sister-in-law, Emily, is a talented pianist herself. Sophie nodded eagerly and settled at the piano. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the studio. I watched Emily's expression soften as she listened to Sophie play, her fingers unconsciously moving along with the familiar melody. When Sophie finished, Emily applauded warmly. That was beautiful, she said. Your phrasing in the middle section was especially lovely. Sophie beamed at the praise. Would you like to hear another piece? Ms. Isabella has been helping me prepare for conservatory auditions. I'd love to, Emily replied, and I saw genuine interest replace the careful politeness she usually showed. For the next hour, Emily sat in on Sophie's lesson, occasionally offering gentle suggestions about technique. Her comments were insightful, focused on helping rather than criticizing, nothing like Margaret's harsh judgments. After Sophie left, Emily turned to me. About that teaching position, were you serious? Completely, I assured her. The studio's reputation is growing, and I'd love to have another instructor who understands that music is about joy, not just perfect performance. Mother will be furious, Emily said, but she was smiling. She's still processing yesterday's revelations. When she called me last night, she couldn't stop talking about your trophies and the article she found about your Carnegie Hall debut. I laughed softly. I imagine that was quite a shock for her. You have no idea. Emily shook her head. I think it's the first time I've ever heard her admit she might have been wrong about something. She even suggested I should take lessons from you. Can you imagine? Well, I said, patting my still flat stomach, I could use the help, especially with the baby coming. Teaching here could be your chance to step out of the performer spotlight and into something you actually love. Emily was quiet for a moment, looking around the Summit studio. You know what's strange? She finally said. For years, Mother held you up as an example of what not to be, someone who just played at being musical. Now she'll probably do the opposite. That's why I kept quiet for so long, I admitted. I didn't want to be another measuring stick for her to use. Music shouldn't be about comparison or status. It should be about passion and connection. Emily nodded slowly. Like what I saw with Sophie today. She wasn't playing to impress anyone. She was playing because she loved the music. Exactly, I smiled. So what do you say? Ready to scandalize your mother by becoming a teacher? Emily laughed, a real laugh, not her usual polite titter. You know what? I think I am. 6 months later, I sat at my studio piano, my growing baby bump making it slightly harder to reach the keys. The sound of music drifted from various practice rooms, Emily teaching in one, Sophie practicing in another. The studio had flourished with Emily's help, allowing me to take occasional breaks as my pregnancy progressed. A familiar tap of heels in the hallway made me look up. Margaret stood in the doorway, holding a thick folder. I found these in my attic, she said, approaching the piano. Emily's old recital programs. I thought perhaps your students might like to try some of the pieces. This was the new Margaret, still proud and proper, but somehow softer around the edges. Ever since discovering my musical background, she'd been finding ways to contribute to the studio without trying to control it. Thank you, I said, accepting the folder. The students always enjoy learning pieces with a family connection. Margaret's eyes drifted to the latest addition to our wall of achievements, a group photo from last month's student showcase. In the center, Emily stood beaming beside me, clearly in her element as a teacher. I never thought, Margaret began, and paused. I spent so many years pushing Emily toward the wrong dream, and criticizing you for following the right one. I touched the keys softly, playing in gentle melody. You wanted the best for your children. You just had a very specific idea of what best meant. Like how I insisted Emily continue performing even when she was clearly unhappy, Margaret sighed. Or how I assumed you couldn't teach my grandchild music without a European education. The melody beneath my fingers shifted to a lullaby, one my grandfather had taught me. You know, I said, my grandfather always said music isn't about where you learned it, but how you feel it. He played in small-town concert halls his whole life, but his passion touched more lives than any famous performer. From one of the practice rooms, we heard Emily laughing with a young student. Margaret smiled, a real, warm smile that I'd rarely seen before. She's happy, Margaret observed. Happier than she ever was performing. And you? She gestured at the wall of student photos. You've built something remarkable here. Just then, Thomas appeared in the doorway. Ready for the doctor's appointment, he asked, then noticed his mother. Mom, I didn't know you were visiting today. Just dropping off some old music books, Margaret said. She hesitated, then added, and perhaps, if you're not too busy, I could come to the appointment. I'd love to see my grandchild. Thomas looked at me, leaving the decision in my hands. I nodded, smiling. We'd like that. As we gathered our things, a melody drifted from Emily's teaching room. The same Rachmaninoff piece I played the day everything changed. But this time it was being played by one of our advanced students, with Emily gently guiding them through the difficult passages. You know, Margaret said as we walked to the car, I've been thinking about taking piano lessons myself. It's never too late to learn, is it? I exchanged a glance with Thomas, who looked as surprised as I felt. Never too late, I agreed. Emily has an opening on Thursday afternoons. Emily? Margaret raised an eyebrow. Not you. Emily's the better teacher for beginners, I said honestly. She remembers what it's like to play for the joy of it, not just for perfection. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Yes, she finally said. I think I'd like that. Later that evening, after the doctor confirmed we were having a girl, we all gathered in our living room. The piano that had once been a source of tension now sat proudly in the center, its surface holding both my competition trophies and Emily's old recital photos. Emily played a gentle piece while Margaret talked about converting her formal dining room into a music room for her future granddaughter. Thomas kept one hand on my stomach, feeling our daughter kick in response to her aunt's playing. Looking around at my family, not perfect, but perfectly real, I thought about how music had finally brought us together instead of driving us apart. My grandfather had been right. Music isn't about perfection or prestige. It's about connection, growth, and the joy of sharing something beautiful with the people you love. As if sensing my thoughts, my daughter gave another strong kick. I placed my hand over Thomas's and smiled. Our little girl would grow up surrounded by music, not just the kind that wins competitions, but the kind that heals hearts and builds bridges. And that was the greatest victory of all.